our topic for this week, we will talk about the methods of research in psychology. Part 1 pa lang to, no? Kasi medyo mahaba tong lesson na ito, so I divided this into 2 parts. This is part 1. Remember, pinag-usapan natin in the previous lectures that psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Napakahalaga na tandaan natin that our field, psychology, is considered a science. Therefore, ano ngayon kung ang psychology is science, the way we answer questions in our field uses a scientific way, di ba? Paano tayo sumagot ng mga tanong in psychology? We use methods of science. Hindi tayo nanguhula, hindi tayo gumagamit ng intuition, hindi natin ginagamit yung faith natin to talk about principles of the human mind. Now, don't get me wrong, hindi ko sinasabing mali ang faith. It's just that in psychology, we cannot use faith as the only reason or as the only basis for saying something about the human mind. Kasi nga, we are a scientific field. We follow the scientific method. So, lahat ng sinasabi natin in psychology, before we make it known public, kailangan produkto yan ng scientific method. And whenever you use the scientific method, dito na ngayon papasok yung ating paggawa ng tinatawag na research. So when you use the scientific method, automatic, you are going to do research. And as you have already heard in my previous lecture videos, research is all about establishing a knowledge. You are discovering or you are in the process of discovering knowledge. And that's what we do as psychologists. We use the scientific method to discover knowledge about how the mind works. So in relation to that, ito yung mga goals na gusto kong makuha ninyo in our lessons. This one and the next video. Familiarize you with the different research methods used in psychology. Importante yan kasi remember your final project is about an original psychological research that you are going to do. So, kinakailangan alam nyo yung iba't ibang mga options na pwede mong gamitin in terms of research methods. And of course, number 2, I would also like to teach you to match what kinds of questions you must be answered by which research method. Kinakailangan meron kayong skill na alam nyo kung anong research method yung nababagay sa isang research question. Kasi, what research method are you going to use? Ang dami-dami nating research methods in psychology. How do you know which one to use? The answer is, depende yan sa kung anong klaseng tanong meron ka. So, yun yung ibig sabihin ng number 2. Tuturuan ko kayo kung papaano i-match yung research method na gagamitin ninyo depende sa question na tinatanong ninyo. Okay? So, the question now is, how many research methods are we going to discuss in this lesson? We are going to discuss 8 research methods. Kaya nga, hinati ko yung lesson natin into 2 para hindi naman kayo masyadong ma-overwhelm. Actually, mali, no? Hindi pala 8, it's 9. Nadoble yung 5. Sorry about that, no? So, there will be 9 research methods that we are going to discuss. For today, we are going to discuss the following: observation, case study, epidemiological, interview, and survey. Okay? So, iisa-isahin natin yung mga methods na yan. I am going to briefly describe to you kung paano ba yan ginagawa, what kinds of questions ang kayang sagutin ng mga methods na ito. And I hope that by doing this, you will be able to come up with an idea on what method yung gusto nyong o what kind of questions na ang gusto nyong gamitin o gusto nyong itanong in the future when you do your original psychological research. Let's talk about method number 1. Paano ba gumagawa ng observation research? In observation research, basically, we are passively describing a psychological phenomenon. Ibig sabihin ng salitang passive, hindi natin ini-impluwensyahan o hindi natin masyadong kinokontrol yung psychological variable na gusto nating pag-aralan. We just sit from afar and then we observe what's happening in in the social world. No, we are just sitting from afar, and then we observe the psychological variable that we are trying to study. Merong dalawang klaseng observation research, pwedeng naturalistic, pwede ring laboratory. Pag sinabi mong laboratory, you are doing your observation obviously inside the lab, but in psychological research, lalong-lalo na sa social psychology, mas madalas ginagamit yung naturalistic observational research. Ibig sabihin kasi ng naturalistic observation research, you go in a setting that is very naturalistic for people, and that is where you observe para mahuli natin yung actual o yung normal behavior ng mga tao in everyday life. That could be in a mall, that could be inside a church, that could be in a school campus, basta kung saang merong public place where people are there, pwede tayong gumawa ng naturalistic observation. One classic example of observation research na ginawa in the field of psychology was the study by Jane Goodall, where she observed chimpanzees. Okay, nagpunta siya sa isang jungle at inobserbahan lang niya yung mga ginagawa ng mga chimpanzees. At marami siyang natutunan dito sa kanyang pag-aaral na ito. Like for example, she discovered from observing chimpanzees na ang mga unggoy pala ay meron ding politics, meron silang leaders, meron din silang subordinates, meron din silang mga parang political parties. And some political parties are more powerful than the other parties. Do you know that based on her observation, nakita rin niya that they are capable of feeling human emotions. Marami tayong mga emotions na nararamdaman din ng mga unggoy, tulad ng jealousy, anger, at marami pang iba. And what's more controversial, ang pinaka-controversial sa nakita ni Jane Goodall is, do you know that monkeys have the capability to use technology? Ibig sabihin, kaya nilang gumawa ng mga technological innovation to solve their everyday problem. One good example na nakita niya from her observation research was yung mga monkeys, meron silang capability na kumuha ng mga langgam from underground using technology. As you know, karamihan ng mga langgam nasa ilalim ng lupa. Paano mo makukuha yung mga langgam sa ilalim ng lupa para makain ng mga monkeys? Ang ginagawa ng mga monkeys, kumukuha sila ng mga branches from the tree. So, yung stick na yon, itutusok nila sa lupa, and then from there, yung mga langgam aakyat doon sa stick, and then parang barbecue, they are going to eat the ants that are walking on the stick. You call that technology. You call that innovation. And monkeys that Goodall observed are capable of doing that. Some important tools na pwede mong gamitin while doing observation studies, obviously, syempre dapat may dala kang notebook. Diyan mo ilalagay yung mga bagay na nakikita mo. Kung gusto mong mag-upgrade, pwede ka na rin gumamit ng video camera while you are observing things. And may paminsan-minsan gumagamit din ng checklist. Checklist, this is a list, a paper where the expected behaviors that you expect to see in the natural setting are written there. And then pag nakita mo nangyari yung isang behavior, you are going to check that item from the checklist. Another very common tool na ginagamit yan in doing observation research. Now, let's move on to case study. Ano pinagkaiba ng case study sa observation research? Actually, halos pareho lang sila, but the only difference is case studies are more detailed and have longer duration. You know, in case study kasi, ang gusto mong malaman dyan is almost everything about the subject that you are trying to observe. Kasi in observation research, usually meron ka lang isang bagay na gusto mong makita. Like for example, how people flirt in a bar, or how women talk to men, 'di ba? Yun lang yung gusto mong i-observe. But in case study, halos lahat gusto mong i-document. That's why sinabi ko nga kanina doon sa slide, usually it's very detailed and it is done in longer duration. Most case studies will involve the researcher to live with the subject that he or she is trying to study. Talagang hanggat posible, hanggat maaari, makikitira ka doon sa subject na pinag-aaralan mo para mag-gather mo lahat ng information about the subject that you are trying to study. Now, the question is, in the first place, bakit ka ba nagki-case study? Usually, case studies are being used kapag merong condition yung isang subject that is very unusual. In psychology, we use case studies for unusual phenomenons. Talagang yung mga bagay na kakaiba, mga psychological phenomenon na mahirap mahanap or hindi laging nangyayari. Let me give you some examples. Halimbawa sa mga movies, di ba? Meron tayong mga napapanood na mga movies na nagdi-display ng mga rare conditions. Like if you have seen the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Ang kakaiba dito kay Benjamin Button, yung kanyang developmental progress baliktad. Nagsimula siya ng matanda, tumatanda siya ng pabata. 'Di ba? If that becomes real, of course it's fiction, hindi totoo 'yan, pero kung maging totoo 'yan, kung talagang merong mga tao na ganun ang developmental progress, I'm sure many psychologists will do a case study on these people. 'Di ba? Bakit ba sila naging ganun? Ano yung mga kinakain nila? How do they spend their day? Ano ba yung mga bagay na nararamdaman nila as they grow older? Again, kung totoo si Benjamin Button, maraming magki-case study sa kanya. Meron pa akong isang movie na napanood which I think a lot of psychologists will do a case study kapag naging totoo, yung The Age of Adeline. 'Di ba? Itong kay Age of Adeline, ang kakaiba naman dito is hindi siya tumatanda. As in yung katawan niya parang young adult forever. Hindi siya nagkakaroon ng mga puting buhok, hindi siya nagkaka-wrinkles, For some reason, yung kanyang developmental progress is stagnant. Again, this is fictional, pero kung naging totoo ito, I'm sure maraming mga psychologists will do a case study on people with this condition. Now, let's talk about some case studies na talagang nangyari in the field of psychology. If you have taken your theories of personality, you remember the case of Anna O. Si Anna O ay isang pasyente ni Sigmund Freud. Remember, Sigmund Freud was a physician before he was full-blown psychologist, di ba? Si Anna O, meron kasi siyang condition, basahin niyo na lang on your own, and that condition by Anna O led Sigmund Freud to develop his psychodynamic theory. Basically, bakit ba nasabi ni Freud that the mind has 3 levels? Merong conscious, subconscious, and the unconscious? All because of what he saw from his case study of Anna O. 'Di ba? That's one thing that you need to remember about case study in psychology. Pwede siyang gamitin to create theories. In fact, marami tayong mga theories in psychology na produkto ng case studies. Like yun na nga yung sinabi ko kanina, the case of Anna O. Another example of a theory in psychology na produkto ng case study was the theory formulated by John Piaget. If you have taken your developmental psychology, ang sabi ni John Piaget, our mind develops into 4 stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Ang tanong, paano nalaman ni John Piaget na yung mind natin undergoes those 4 levels of cognitive development? Guess what? From case study. Sino ang kinase study ni John Piaget? Yung kanyang sariling mga anak. So, si John Piaget, curious siya sa cognitive development. So, ginawa niyang cases yung mga anak niya. From the day that the child was born, hanggang sa lumaki sila, maging teenager sila, maging young adult sila, he documented the cognitive accomplishments na meron yung mga anak niya, and then from there, nabuo niya yung cognitive development theory. Again, let me tell you, case studies are very powerful in psychology that it can be used para gumawa tayo ng mga psychological theories. Let's move on to the third method in doing research in psychology. Ito yung tinatawag nating epidemiological research. Very common ito in clinical psychology, but the approach, we just borrowed this from the field of medicine. So karamihan ng mga epidemiological studies talaga naggaling yan sa field of medicine, pero nakita ng mga psychologists that they can use the approach to come up or to study psychological topics. Ano bang ginagawa sa epidemiological research? We start with statistics, no? So makakabasa tayo ng mga statistics of a given disorder or a condition. And then from there, kapag nakita na natin yung mga statistics, usually sa epidemiological research, gagawa tayo ng mga hypothesis or possible questions that we can ask from the statistics that we observe. Okay, so ganyan ang ginagawa sa epidemiological research. From statistics, we develop certain hypotheses. Let me give you an example of how this is done in the field of clinical psychology. Let me read to you this case. A clinical psychologist is very intrigued with some statistics he saw in a recent report about clinical depression and suicide. Ito yung mga nabasa niyang mga findings on clinical depression and suicide. Number 1, the number of suicide attempts have increased by 42% from the average rate whenever it rains or for at least 3 straight days. Tumataas yung nagsusuicide kapag umuulan ng 3 araw sunod-sunod. And number 2, according to the epidemiological report, the rate of people who reported they are depressed quadrupled after the lead character of a popular soap opera died in the story. So maraming nagpapakamatay kapag merong bida sa isang teleserye ang namamatay. Okay? So these are interesting epidemiological reports, no? So anong gagawin natin sa mga statistics na yan? We are going to generate possible hypotheses. Gagawa tayo ng mga posibleng tanong. O paano natin gagawin yan? Going back to the slide. For number 1, pwede natin itanong ito. A rainy or a gloomy weather may cause biological changes which may explain the experience of depression. Okay? So sorry, typographical yung AY, dapat may yan. Which may explain the experience of depression. So posible na yung weather na maulan, yung weather na gloomy, yun yung nagkokos, no, kung bakit nadidepress yung mga tao. So kaya maraming nadidepress, maraming nagpapakamatay kapag ulan ng ulan, baka kasi may kinalaman yung weather doon sa moods ng tao. So is that true? Yun na nga, gagawa pa tayo ng further research to confirm that. But the epidemiological report gave us an idea what to ask. Did you get that? Another example, balik tayo doon sa number 2. The rate of people who reported nadidepress sila quadrupled after the lead character of a popular soap opera died in the story. Ano ang pwede nating itanong dyan? Ito. Our hypothesis can be, depression can be caused by misfortunes that happen to a media character people identify with. So, pwede tayong gumawa ng isa pang panibagong study para i-test natin kung totoo nga ba na merong parallel yung nangyayari sa bida sa isang teleserye, kung parallel ba siya sa mga emotional experiences ng mga manonood. Diba? So, those are very interesting questions to ask. Where did we get those questions? From epidemiological report. So yan yung silbi ng epidemiological report, no? After seeing the patterns, after seeing the numbers, we come up with more specific psychological questions. Let me give you another epidemiological report and then I challenge you, gumawa kayo ng siguro 2 o 3, 2 to 3 psychological questions that you may ask from this epidemiological report. Halimbawa, ito. The young Filipino sexual behavior. Okay, tingnan nyo na lang yung mga numbers. Ang bottom line ng mga number dito is, parami ng parami ang mga Pilipino, especially the young ones, no? Nag-a-agree sila sa premarital sex. So from there, I would like you to think of 2 to 3 possible psychological questions that you may ask in relation to these numbers. Okay? So, yan ang silbi ng epidemiological report. Let's move on to methodology number 4. In psychological research, pwede ka rin gumawa ng interview research. Pag sinabi mong interview, merong nangyayaring pag-uusap. This is an organized conversation between the researcher and the participant that usually being done one-on-one. Magkaiba ang interview sa simpleng chismisan lang, di ba? Kasi pag simpleng chismisan lang, you jump from one topic to the next. Pero in doing psychological interview, usually, you are very focused on one topic. Meron kang isang psychological variable or meron kang isang psychological experience that you would like to focus on in your interview. So, lahat ng tinatanong mo, lahat ng sinasagot sa'yo ng interviewee mo, is simply revolving around that psychological topic that you choose to study. Let me give you one example of an interview research done by a psychologist. Merong isang psychologist, gusto niyang pag-aralan yung psychology of becoming wealthy. Bakit ba yung mga tao, may ibang mga tao, they are considered filthy rich? Pag sinabi mong filthy rich, yung mga sobrang yaman. Like for example, in this book, The Millionaire Mind, etong si Thomas Stanley, he did an interview research with people who are considered deca-millionaires in America. Pag sinabi mong deca-millionaire ka, you have at least $10 million inside your bank account. Gustong malaman ni Thomas Stanley, bakit ba sila ganun kayaman? Are there any psychological traits they have that make them that rich? Siguro, pag na-develop natin yung mga psychological traits na ito, it can help us to become deca-millionaires. And the answer to that question is yes. Thomas Stanley was able to see different or he was able to see similarities in the psychological profile of people who are deca-millionaires. So ano yung mga psychological traits they have in common that makes them deca-millionaires? Hold on to your seats. Ito ang kanyang sekreto, no? Binase ko to sa libro na sinulat ni Thomas Stanley. According to his book The Millionaire Mind, people with high levels of conscientiousness are more likely to be millionaires in the future. Anong ibig sabihin ng conscientiousness? Reviewin nyo yung theories of personality nyo, di ba? Ito yung letter C doon sa Big Five na ocean. C in the word ocean is conscientiousness. Kapag mataas ka raw sa personality trait na yan, you are more likely to be a millionaire. Second bullet, ang mga taong nagiging deca-millionaires, what do they have in common? Mataas ang kanilang EQ, also known as emotional intelligence, especially people skills. Kasi yung EQ malawak pa yan, no? Marami pang mga sub-skills dyan, pero yung nangungunang sub-skill under emotional intelligence that predict your wealth is your people skills. Kung gaano ka kagaling makisama sa ibang tao, gaano ka kagaling umintindi ng emotions ng ibang tao, that is a predictor of being wealthy. And Thomas Stanley in his book, in-emphasize niya dito na yung IQ mo o yung grades mo sa eskwelahan, it's not a very powerful predictor of being wealthy. In other words, contrary sa tinuturo sa atin ng ating kultura, hindi lahat ng matalino sa eskwelahan nagiging mayaman. If you want to be wealthy, okay, two things that you really need to work on is more on your discipline, which is your conscientiousness, and your ability to relate well with other people. Now, don't get me wrong, no? The book is not saying that IQ is not important. But if you compare IQ with EQ and high conscientiousness, mukhang ang IQ huli sa listahan in terms of predicting who will become wealthy and who will not become wealthy. So kung gusto mo talagang yumaman, ang dalawang powerful predictors talaga dyan is yung disiplina mo at yung abilidad mo to relate well with other people. Another example of an interview research that is very interesting na madalas nang ginagamit sa psychology, especially in forensic psychology, is understanding the minds of serial killers, di ba? Yung mga serial killers in the DSM-5, another term for that, sila yung mga tinatawag natin mga psychopaths. Meron silang psychopathy personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder. 'Di ba? Karamihan ng mga psychopaths merong ganyang disorder. We would like to further understand what is running in their heads. Ano ba yung mga bagay na iniisip nila? Ano ba, how do they see the world? How do they see other people? How do they interpret things in life? So if you want to know, ang gagawin mo, syempre, kung matibay ang loob mo, mag-i-interview ka ng iba't ibang mga serial killers, and then from there, hahanap ka ng mga patterns o ng mga similarities that they have in common. Like for example, in the case of Ted Bundy, isa sa mga pinaka-popular na serial killers in America, you can just watch about him or read about him online. Marami na mga psychologists na nag-interview kay Ted Bundy, and yung mga quotable quotes ni Ted Bundy taught us a lot about how the psychopath mind works. Like for example, bigyan ko kayo ng mga quotable quote na sinabi ni Ted Bundy while being interviewed. Ted Bundy once said, "You learn what you need to kill and take care of the details. It's like changing a tire. The first time you're careful, by the 30th time, you can't remember where you left the lug wrench. Ibig sabihin, what can we learn from this quote from Ted Bundy? Addictive para sa mga psychopaths ang pumatay. 'Di ba? Hindi sila hihinto sa first time na meron silang napatay at hindi sila nahuli. After they become successful in killing someone without getting caught, they move on to the second, they move on to the third, they move on to the fourth without feeling guilty, without any remorse. That's one of the indication of a psychopath's mind. Wala silang guilt. They keep on doing what they want to do over and over again, which is killing another human being. Hindi nila mahinto yung sarili nila at hindi sila nagigilty. Another quote by Ted Bundy, ang sabi niya, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what made people attractive to one another. I didn't know what underlay social interactions." What can we learn from here? One of the characteristics of a psychopath is yung kanilang brain, okay, when it comes to interacting with other people, it's not functioning normally. They cannot empathize. Isa yan sa mga qualities of a psychopath's brain. Wala silang capability to feel what another person is feeling. Kaya nga, hirap silang makipagkaibigan, hirap silang mag-enter into a commitment because of that pattern of their mind. Okay? And the last quote, ito interesting din to, no? Sabi ni Ted Bundy, society wants to believe it can identify evil people or bad or harmful people. Ibig sabihin, the psychopaths. But it's not practical. There are no stereotypes. Ibig sabihin lang dito ni Ted Bundy is yung isang psychopath o yung isang taong may antisocial personality disorder, magaling silang makiblend sa ibang tao. Okay, although they have difficulty maintaining relationships with other people, ang nakakatakot sa kanila is they can pretend they like other people. They can pretend they enjoy being in a group. They pretend they enjoy being inside a family. Okay? Yun yung nakakatakot sa kanila. Kaya nga sabi ni Ted Bundy, there are no stereotypes. Wala kang makikita sa kanila in their outside appearance which may help you think that they are psychopaths. Walang clue, kumbaga. Okay? Talagang they appear normal. Yung iba nga, they appear very appealing. Talagang maraming may gusto sa kanila because they are very charming. But, yun na nga, deep inside, they have a psychopath's mind. So, these are very interesting things that we know about the psychopath's mind. Paano natin nalaman yon? By doing interview research. And last one, as we end the first part of this video, in psychology, gumagawa rin tayo ng survey research. In survey research, ang ginagawa natin dito, we are describing the thinking or the attitude of many people. Let's say, for example, meron kang isang psychological question at gusto mong malaman yung opinion ng maraming tao, as in hundreds or thousands of people, about the psychological question that you want to ask, gagawa ka ng isang survey research. Like for example, gusto mong malaman kung ilang porsyento ba ng mga tao ngayon sa buong mundo ang nag-agree na sa premarital sex. Okay? Or sex before marriage. So, anong gagawin mo? Magpapasurvey ka ngayon ng maraming tao and you will come up with these results. So, this one is a result of a survey research done about premarital sex. No? So, as you read in figure 1, ito yung percent of people saying sex between unmarried adults are morally unacceptable. Masama ang premarital sex. Pinakamarami daw nagsasabi niyan sa Indonesia, pinakakonti nagsasabi niyan sa France. So, this is a survey research. Now, take note, itong survey research na ito can further make you ask other questions, parang epidemiological research, di ba? So, because of these survey results, pwede ka ngayon magtanong ng deeper questions or deeper psychological questions in relation to the survey research. Halimbawa, ito, pwede natin ngayon ikumpara anong meron sa kultura ng France at ibang-iba siya sa mga reactions ng mga tao sa Indonesia when it comes to premarital sex. Now you are entering cultural psychology. What is it in the French culture that they are very accepting of premarital sex compared to those people in Indonesia or maybe in the Philippines? 'Di ba? So, yung survey research na yan, nag-generate tayo ng tanong na isa pang tanong out of this result. So, yan yung isa pang use ng survey research. Again, nagkakaroon tayo ng mga bagong ideas that we want to research about. Another example would be this one. The importance of religion in the Philippines from 2015 to 2017. Okay? So, in fairness naman, mula 2015 hanggang 2017, mas marami pa rin mga Pilipino, 85%, saying importante pa rin ang religion sa buhay nila. Only 15% are saying it's not important. So, a deeper question to ask here is, ano ba yung mga nagiging benefits ng mga tao who are religious? Why do they consider religion still important in their life? Bakit mataas pa rin sa mga Pilipino yung religion? Ano ba yung mga mabuting na idudulot ng religion sa buhay ng isang Pilipino? Now you enter the field of the psychology of religion, 'di ba? So yan din, no, parang epidemiological research lang din yung survey research. Okay, we look at the numbers and then from there mag-iisip tayo ng mga panibagong psychological questions. Now you might be confused, anong pinagkaiba ng survey research sa epidemiology? Sa epidemiology kasi, yung mga numbers na nakikita natin doon is what we observe. Binibilang lang natin through frequency counts. Pero sa survey research kasi, hindi lang tayo basta-basta nag-o-observe, hindi tayo nag-o-observe at binibilang natin. What we do in survey research is, tayong mga psychologists yung nag-generate ng question, and then we go to our subjects or to our participants to find out their answers to our survey questions. Yun yung pinagkaiba ng dalawang methods na yan. But even if they are different, pareho sila ng function na ginagawa, it can further give us new questions to ask in the field of psychology. Ito lang, one last. Agree or disagree? Married couples who have already separated and cannot reconcile anymore, kinakailangan na rin silang payagan mag-divorce. Ito yung attitude ng mga tao from 2005 to 2017. So kung mapapansin ninyo, just see the green parts, yung mga strongly agree and somewhat agree. The trend is, parami yung mga tao na nag-a-agree na dapat nang illegalize yung divorce. Okay? So that's survey research. Nalaman natin yan through survey research. Now, a deeper question to ask is, bakit kaya yung mga Pilipino nag-a-agree na sa idea ng divorce? Nag-iba na ba yung pananaw ng mga Pilipino sa marriage? How did they look at marriage in the first place? Diba? These are deeper psychological questions that we can ask na nalaman natin, na naitanong natin because of a survey result that we were able to see. Okay? So those are the research methods na pinag-usapan natin for today, na sana nagkaroon kayo ng idea, lalong-lalo na in doing your original research in the future. Now, just some takeaways before I end this video. Ano ba yung mga importanteng bagay na dapat nalaman nyo in today's video? Number one, I hope you realize that psychology, again, it is a scientific field, so talk like one. How do you talk like a psychologist? How do you talk like a scientist? Whenever you say something about how the mind works, kinakailangan meron kang basis. At yung basis natin in our field is a research study. Ibig sabihin, huwag kang magkalat ng information about how the mind works na wala kang basis from a scientific research. Lahat ng sinasabi mo about how the mind works, people expect you to have a scientific basis to back up your claims. Kasi kapag sabi ka lang ng sabi ng mga bagay tungkol sa how the mind works na wala ka namang basihan, wala ka nang pinakaiba sa mga kanto boy or kanto girl, sa mga chismoso at chismosa. Diba? We are not chismoso and chismosa. You don't have an AB Psych degree para lang mag-chismis ka. The reason why you are being trained to be a psychologist is because you say things with scientific basis. Okay, so sana maging kaugalian natin yan. When we say something about how the mind works, let's back it up by scientific research. Number two, research question must determine the research method. Ganyan ang tamang pattern. Mag-i-start ka sa tanong, and then your question will determine what method are you going to use. Lalong-lalo na in the future, kapag gagawa na kayo ng original psychological research. Don't start with the method. Kasi karamihan, yan yung madalas na pagkakamali ng mga students in psychological research. They start with the method. Pipili sila ng favorite method nila, interview, o kaya, experiment. And then from there, iisip sila ng tanong na magkakasya doon sa experiment. Iisip sila ng tanong na magkakasya sa interview. Hindi dapat ganon. Baliktad. You start with a question. Ask something that really interests you. Ask something that you are really so motivated to answer, and then from there, you plan the methodology. Ganun ang tamang research. Hindi yung nagsisimula ka sa method, parang gusto kong gumawa ng interview. Tapos doon ka palang gagawa ng tanong, nakakasya sa interview. It must not be the case. Start with a question, and then from there, you plan which method is the most appropriate for your question. And last one, number 3, there is no best research method. Diba? Sa dinami namin ng research methods in psychology, a lot of students are asking, sir, what's the best method? Walang best method. Hindi tayo nagko-contest dito kung ano ang pinakamagandang method. Because remember, in psychology, the different research methods, as you can see on the screen, they feed one another. At I think, na-demonstrate ko yan ngayon, di ba? Yung epidemiological research, nakagawa ka ng mga bagong hypothesis. Yung nakita mo sa survey research, pwede ka mag-follow up ng interview research. Diba? So, ganun dapat ang treatment natin sa mga methods in doing research in psychology. Hindi sila nagpapagalingan. Rather, we can integrate all the methods to guide us to come up with more interesting psychological questions. So I hope you learned something from our today's lecture. Abangan nyo yung second part of this video on the research methods in the field of psychology. Thank you and God bless.